Were Ancient Egyptians Black? Part 2. We spoke in the previous video of black pharaohs. Let's see if there were any white ancient Egyptians. Cleopatra's immense power came from her position in Egypt's long-ruling Ptolemaic dynasty. The question of her appearance is somewhat entangled with that identity. Her family hailed not from the land it governed but from Macedonia, which has led many researchers to believe her skin was light, as European art has always depicted her, not dark like that of the native Egyptians. Some, like Cleopatra biographer Michael Grant, are adamant that she had not a drop of Egyptian blood in her veins. Others point to uncertainties in her family tree. The lineage of her father, Ptolemy XII, a pharaoh himself, is well documented. Her mother's not so much. In fact, no one is sure of her mother's identity, and even less so of her grandparents. Still others note that Macedonia, along with the rest of the Hellenic world, was not exclusively white, so her European descent did not preclude blackness. The ethnic uncertainty surrounding Cleopatra has made her into an unlikely proxy for today's cultural debates. Most recently, the casting of Israeli actress Gal Gadot as the queen in an upcoming film met with disappointment and outrage from critics who hope to see a woman of African heritage fill the role. But the concept of a dark-skinned Cleopatra originated much earlier, when the 19th-century artist William Wetmore Story sculpted her with black features as an abolitionist statement. The famous bust of Nefertiti. Proponents of the view that all ancient Egyptians were black are constantly insisting that the famous bust of Queen Nefertiti currently held in the Museum in Berlin must be a fake because it portrays Nefertiti with pale skin. They tried to come up with all sorts of other arguments for why it must be a fake, with one of them being that the bust is too well preserved to be over 3,000 years old. None of these arguments hold up to any scrutiny. There are plenty of other representations of Egyptian women with pale skin, and there are plenty of works of art that are even older than the Nefertiti bust that are just as well preserved. In reality, the bust is almost certainly authentic, but its authenticity is largely irrelevant to the question of what skin colors people in ancient Egypt had, since it is clearly an example of the standard Egyptian convention of portraying women with pale skin as a marker of their femininity. As is the case with most works of Egyptian art from before the Hellenistic period, the Nefertiti bust tells us a lot more about the conventions of ancient Egyptian art than it does about Nefertiti's actual appearance. Realistic portraits of ordinary people from Lower Egypt from the Hellenistic and Roman periods. Images of people from the early periods of Egyptian history are highly conventionalized, and they do not normally portray the specific details of the appearances of individual people. Mummies can be misleading, since the process of embalming can change a person's appearance significantly. Greek sources describing the Egyptians' appearance are largely based on stereotypes. Finally, genetic studies on ancient Egyptian remains are limited. Our sources for what people during pharaonic times looked like then is complicated to say the least. They do, however, give us a general picture of what Egypt looked like during the time of the pharaohs, an eastern Mediterranean country with a diverse population of people, the majority of whom seem to have had brown skin, but substantial minorities of whom seem to have had darker or lighter skin tones. Once we start getting into the Hellenistic period, lasted c. 323, c. 31 BC, and Roman period, lasted c. 31 BC, c. 646 AD, of Egyptian history, though we finally start to get realistic portraits of what real people looked like when they were alive. In particular, we have a pretty good impression of what people from Lower Egypt during the Hellenistic and Roman periods looked like thanks to the wealth of highly detailed, realistic encaustic panel portraits that have survived from the region from these periods of Egyptians' history. These are funerary portraits that originally covered the faces of the mummified bodies of the individuals they depict. They are conventionally known as the Fayum mummy portraits because many of them were found at sites located near the Fayum Basin in Lower Egypt. They depict ordinary people from the upper and middle classes.